Granite Classical Tutorials is a tutorial service spanning grades 1 through 12, designed to give structure and support to the classical homeschool. We offer families the structure and rigor of the classical method blended with the flexibility and autonomy of homeschooling. The result is a truly unique educational experience. At Granite, you, the homeschooling parent, are the primary educator, but you are not alone in your homeschooling endeavor. Our tutors come alongside you to provide you with the curriculum and methodologies you need to effectively homeschool in the classical tradition. Meeting twice per week for tutorial instruction, Granite classes bring excellence and structure to the classical homeschooling experience. The call for a classical education model in the 20th century was probably most famously articulated in the 1940s by British author Dorothy Sayers. It was present in the early to mid-1900s in many private and parish schools, and it really took off in the United States as an independent movement in the early 1990s. But a classical education is actually the original way of learning in Western civilization. It's not something new, but rather a return to the old. A classical education is essentially the kind of education that the revolutionary colonists received, and it looks pretty different from a typical modern-day education. Back in 1700, this is what one had to be capable of, academically, to gain admittance to Harvard College.
Everyone competent to read Cicero or any other classic author of that kind, extemporaneously, and also to speak and write Latin prose and verse with tolerable skill and without assistance, and of declining the Greek nouns and verbs, may expect to be admitted to the college. If deficient in any of these qualifications, he cannot, under any circumstances, be admitted.
This might make you wonder how many Harvard graduates today could speak and write Latin prose and verse with tolerable skill and without assistance. How many have mastery of Greek declensions? How many could even read Cicero extemporaneously, that is, simply read him well and accurately without notice or preparation? Aside from a handful of classics majors, most Harvard students today probably don't even know who Cicero is, much less can they deliver one of his speeches with rhetorical skill. But the Harvard freshman of 1700 could, and with good reason. The Harvard student of 1700 was exposed to an intense liberal arts curriculum. The student of Harvard's early days was expected to stretch his mind across all fields of study, from mathematics and the sciences, to languages, to ethical and political discourse, history, and theology. The students who entered a course of study like this one had to already possess the basic tools of scholarship, as well as a basic study of the great minds of the past in order to thrive. And the students who graduated from this kind of study, well, they were men like John Adams and John Hancock, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. After such an education, these men were prepared to embark upon one of the greatest social and political experiments of Western history, the creation of a constitutional republic. They did what had never been done before, but they did not go into the great experiment of American government blindly. Instead, they were rooted in their cultural inheritance. They learned from the great minds of the past, and they were equipped to creatively and deftly maneuver their present-day circumstances for the betterment of their society because their education had prepared them to do so. Imagine the student who comes out of Harvard in the late 16 or early 1700s. He is culturally rooted, broadly educated, and he is a critical and creative thinker. And now, consider this assessment of the Ivy League student of today from Professor Patrick Deneen, who is taught at Princeton, Georgetown, and currently Notre Dame.
My students are know-nothings. Their brains are largely empty, devoid of any substantial knowledge that might be the fruits of an education, in an inheritance and a gift of a previous generation. They are the culmination of Western civilization, a civilization that has forgotten nearly everything about itself, and as a result has achieved near-perfect indifference in its own culture. They are the cream of their generation, the masters of the universe, a generation in waiting to run America and the world. But ask them some basic questions about the civilization they will be inheriting, and be prepared for averted eyes and somewhat panicked looks.
But this problem is much greater than simply a lack of knowledge of the seminal events and minds of the past. Dorothy Sayers identified the heart of the problem back in the 1940s. She said this:
"Today, a great number, perhaps the majority, of the men and women have never, even in a lingering traditional memory, undergone the scholastic discipline. Less and less do the children who come to be educated bring any of that tradition with them. We have lost the tools of learning."
What Sayers is arguing for here is an educational method that focuses on the art of learning, an art deeply rooted in the Western heritage of education. And the problem has only amplified since Sayers first identified it. The primary school education of the technological age all too often teaches students merely to download information and opinion and play it back without much critical analysis. Students are not prepared to engage critically and soundly with great minds like Homer, Cicero, Chaucer, or Milton, because more often than not, they have not been taught to think critically and reason soundly. This deficiency is precisely what the classical method of education seeks to rectify. What sets the classical methodology apart from other teaching methods is that its primary goal is to teach students the art of learning. It's a teaching method that enables students to engage with the great minds of their cultural inheritance and to learn and think for themselves. The classical student reads broadly, deeply, and carefully to build knowledge. Then, through discussions with peers and tutors, the classical student thinks critically about that knowledge. Finally, the classical student develops discernment and allows his or her worldview to be rightly informed by studies. Only after this full cycle of learning can an individual blossom into his or her full potential as a thinking individual. Classical students have engaged with the great minds of the past, and they can express their opinions about these great minds with alacrity and winsomeness. They enter the world unafraid to encounter opinions contrary to their own, because they know that truth stands to reason, and they are eager to hone their own worldviews by engaging others. Most importantly, they are ready and willing to inherit the cultural heritage being passed on to them. Professor Patrick Deneen writes that his students are perfectly hollowed vessels, receptive and obedient without any real obligations or devotions. But this is not the legacy of the classically educated student. The classically educated student does not blindly follow, but instead engages with the hardest questions, seeks out wisdom, and thinks creatively to apply it for the betterment of society. And this is exactly what the framers of our Constitution did as well. Instead of blindly following the customs of the past, which would have resulted in a monarchy, they engaged with the greatest political and philosophical minds and established a creative new way of governing that took the best wisdom of the past and the present and applied it to the unique American situation. Founding Father James Madison wrote this about the development of the United States government.
Is it not the glory of the people of America that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times in other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration for antiquity, for customs, or for names to overrule the suggestions of their own good sense, the knowledge of their own situation, and the lessons of their own experience? To this manly spirit, posterity will be indebted for the possession, and the world for the example of numerous innovations displayed on the American theater in favor of private rights and public happiness. Had no important step been taken by the leaders of the Revolution for which a precedent could not be discovered, no government established of which an exact model did not present itself, the people of the United States might, at this moment, have been numbered among the melancholy victims of misguided counsels, must at best have been laboring under the weight of some of those forms which have crushed the liberties of the rest of mankind. Happily for America, happily we trust for the whole human race, they pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society. They reared the fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. They formed the design of a great confederacy, which it is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate.
As we know, Madison and his compatriots did improve upon the Confederacy, establishing a constitution which secured invaluable freedoms and a brilliant system of government for the American people. Arguably, the framers accomplished what they did because their classical education resulted in a view of the world that valued things like freedom, individual worth, equal opportunity, representative government, separation of powers, freedom of religion, speech, assembly, and press, and justice grounded in due process and the presumption of innocence. They were deeply committed to these ideals because they had thought through them critically and found them sound. Moreover, they were able to express and rhetorically defend their commitment to these ideals so well that they won over the colonists to revolution and then the American people to the ratification of the Constitution. The best way to continue to perpetuate the brilliant system they created is by educating the generations to come with a methodology that, in the words of Dorothy Sayers, teaches men how to learn for themselves. Students so educated are the best equipped to better our society by perpetuating its freedoms. Your students deserve the autonomy and agency to think for themselves, and that means learning how to learn and engaging with the best minds our culture has to offer. When they have done this, they will be able, like Madison, to recognize the legacy they are inheriting and use it for good. If you are interested in visiting Granite or in enrolling in our tutorial service, please contact us. We are eager to come alongside you as you prepare your students to receive the full benefits of their cultural inheritance by teaching them to learn for themselves.